What if the one sentence you say as a joke turns out to be the truest thing you've ever said? Henry Walsh didn't know that answer yet, but he was about to find out, and so are you. Stay with this one, because the ending is not what it looks like at the start. Henry Walsh was 64 years old, and for the last 9 years, he had run Walsh and Daughters, a narrow little record shop tucked between a laundromat and a closed shoe repair store on a quiet street in Savannah, Georgia. The name was a leftover from a dream he and his late wife, Margaret, used to share: 2 daughters who never came, a marriage that lasted 31 years, and a silence that arrived the day Margaret's heart simply stopped beating in her sleep. Henry kept the shop open after that, not because it made money, but because the smell of old vinyl and cardboard sleeves was the closest thing he had left to a conversation with her. He alphabetized records that almost no one bought anymore. He drank his coffee black and standing up. He told himself, more than once, that this was simply what the rest of his life would look like. Then, on an unremarkable Tuesday in March, the bell above the door rang, and a woman walked in shaking rain from her umbrella. Her name was Claire Bennett, 29 years old, a freelance writer working on a long-form piece about the vanishing record stores of the American South. She had a notebook full of questions and absolutely no intention of falling for any of the answers. She asked Henry about the shop's history, about Margaret, about why a man who could have retired years ago chose to keep paying rent on a business that barely survived. Henry, who hadn't talked about Margaret to a stranger in years, found himself talking for almost 2 hours. Claire didn't write a single note. She just listened. She came back the following week, and the week after that. Officially, it was research. Unofficially, neither of them said the word that actually applied. Over the spring, their conversations stretched from records into childhoods, from childhoods into the things they were both quietly afraid of: Henry's fear of being forgotten, Claire's fear of never writing anything that mattered. Somewhere in May, Henry noticed he'd started wiping down the same counter twice on the days she usually came in, just so his hands would have something to do besides shake a little. On a Thursday evening in June, after he'd flipped the sign to closed, they sat on 2 mismatched stools behind the counter, sharing a thermos of coffee while a slow rain traced lines down the front window. Claire was laughing, really laughing, head tipped back, at a story Henry told about the time Margaret had tried to alphabetize his entire collection by mood instead of artist. Watching her laugh, something loosened in Henry's chest that had been tight for almost a decade. Before he could stop himself, he said it. "If I were 20 years younger, I think I'd ask you to marry me." He said it the way you say something you don't expect to be taken seriously. Half a joke, half a confession wearing a joke's clothes, an exit ramp built in before the sentence was even finished. He was already reaching for a laugh to follow it, already preparing the next sentence that would walk it back into safety. Claire didn't laugh. She looked at him for a long moment, the rain ticking against the glass, and said quietly, "That doesn't matter to me." 4 words. Henry would replay them more times than he could count over the following weeks, turning them over like a coin he couldn't decide was real or counterfeit. He didn't sleep well that night, and it had nothing to do with the coffee. For days afterward, Henry found himself rehearsing arguments against his own hope. He was 35 years older than her, old enough to be her father, a fact he was sure her friends would say within the first 5 minutes of meeting him. He pictured Claire's parents' faces. He pictured the whispers that would follow them down the street, the assumptions people would make about why a young woman would want anything to do with a 64-year-old widower running a failing record shop. He told himself it was kinder to let the moment pass quietly, to let it become one of those things 2 people simply agree never to mention again. Except Claire didn't let it pass. She kept coming to the shop. She kept asking about his day, bringing him a second coffee without being asked, sitting closer than research required. The open loop Henry had tried to close kept reopening itself every time she walked through the door, and he realized, with something between fear and relief, that the question hanging between them wasn't going away just because he was too afraid to pick it back up. One afternoon, a regular customer named Walter, a retired schoolteacher who'd been buying jazz records from Henry for 15 years, lingered by the register longer than usual. He'd seen Claire leaving the shop the day before, laughing at something Henry had said from the doorway. "You know what people will say," Walter muttered, not unkindly, sliding his change across the counter. "A man your age, a girl that young. They'll say you're foolish. Or worse." Henry didn't argue. He simply nodded, slipped the record into a paper sleeve, and said nothing else. But that night, Lying awake in the same bed he'd shared with Margaret for 3 decades, Walter's words sat on his chest like a stone, heavier than any joke he'd made behind that counter. It was Claire who finally forced the conversation into daylight. On a warm Sunday afternoon, she suggested a walk through Forsyth Park, past the old fountain where tourists posed for photographs. Henry used the walk to finally say everything he'd been swallowing for weeks. His fear of being a burden, his fear of being laughed at, his fear that he was a foolish old man mistaking kindness for something it wasn't. Claire let him finish. Then she stopped walking, turned to face him fully, and said the words that would end up framed, years later, on the wall behind the shop's register. "People are going to find something to judge no matter what we do," she told him. "The only question that actually matters is whether you make me happy. And you do." Henry didn't have an answer for that. He didn't need one. For the first time since Margaret died, he let himself want something out loud instead of guarding it like a secret. A week after that conversation in the park, Claire showed up at the shop carrying a small cardboard box instead of her usual notebook. Inside was a single record, a worn copy of an old soul album Henry had mentioned once, in passing, months earlier, the kind of detail most people would have forgotten the moment it left his mouth. "You said your dad used to play this on Sunday mornings," she said, setting it on the counter like it was nothing. "I found it in a shop 2 towns over." Henry turned the sleeve over in his hands for a long time before he trusted himself to speak. It wasn't the record itself that undid him. It was the fact that she'd been listening that closely, that whole time, to a man who had spent years assuming no one was. Their first real date came 3 weeks later, not coffee at the shop, but dinner at a small Italian place near the river, candles, a bottle of wine Henry was too nervous to actually taste. Word got around Savannah the way word always does in a small town. There were comments, exactly as Henry had feared, a cousin who stopped calling, a long-time customer who made a pointed remark about appropriate relationships and never came back to the shop. But there were other reactions too, ones Henry hadn't braced for. An old friend who simply said, "Margaret would be glad you're not alone." And Claire's own mother, who, after one long dinner with Henry, told her daughter privately that she'd never seen Claire look so unguarded around anyone. What surprised Henry most wasn't the judgment, he'd expected that. It was how little it mattered once it actually arrived. He had spent so many nights bracing for criticism that he'd forgotten to ask himself a simpler question. What was he protecting exactly by staying alone? A version of himself that had already stopped existing the day Margaret closed her eyes for the last time. There was one night, though, that tested even that. Claire's older brother called her in the middle of dinner, voice loud enough that Henry could hear it from across the table, demanding to know if she'd lost her mind. Claire didn't flinch. She simply said, "I haven't lost anything. I think I finally found something," and hung up before he could answer. Henry reached for her hand under the table, and for once he didn't say a word about being too old to deserve it. Even Walter eventually came around. He showed up at the shop one Saturday with a bottle of bourbon under his arm, set it on the counter without much ceremony, and said, "I was wrong to say what I said. A man can be lonely for a long time before he notices he doesn't have to be." Henry poured 2 glasses, right there between the shelves, and they didn't talk about Claire again. They didn't need to. A year after that rainy Thursday evening behind the counter, Henry and Claire stood beneath a string of small white lights in the back garden of the shop, the same floorboards Margaret had once walked, the same shelves of records, rearranged just enough to make room for 30 folding chairs and the people who actually mattered. Claire wore her grandmother's pearl earrings. Henry wore a tie Claire had picked out herself, dark blue, because she said it matched the cover of the first record she ever bought from him. When it came time for vows, Henry didn't try to be clever. He simply said that he had spent 9 years believing his story was already finished, and that Claire had walked in out of the rain and proven him wrong without even trying. Claire, in turn, told him that she hadn't come looking for love when she walked into his shop that Tuesday. She'd come looking for a story about a dying business. She just hadn't expected to find the most alive thing in her life standing behind the counter. As Henry slipped the ring onto her finger, he finally understood what those 4 words back in June had really meant. Age wasn't the thing 2 people had to match to build something real. What mattered was whether someone saw you, not the man you used to be, not the man other people expected you to become, but exactly who you were, standing quietly behind a counter full of other people's old songs, hoping someone might finally stay to hear yours. Walter stood near the back during the ceremony, glass of bourbon in hand instead of wine, and when Henry caught his eye across the garden, the old school teacher simply raised his glass an inch and nodded, as if to say he understood now what he hadn't understood months before. Claire's mother sat in the front row, dabbing her eyes with a tissue she'd brought specifically because she'd suspected she would need it. Nobody who mattered was missing. They didn't close the shop that night. They simply turned the sign around, just for an hour, so the man who'd once told a joke to protect himself from hope could finally believe the answer he'd been given was true all along.